ship left on the dock for more than 24 hours will be compressed to a cube at the owner's expense. Welcome to Sacred Cow Shipyards.
As a reminder, we are doing a fundraiser for Toys for Tots for the next month on your planet. I would note that y'all kind of broke the goal within the first, 3 hours of the fundraiser being posted, so I have a new challenge for you that I may have mentioned previously. If you get the fundraiser to $4,000, I will drop the episode that I have saved up for 40,000 subscribers. And yes, the topic of the episode is somewhat predictable. In fact, I get away with using this particular graphic in the middle of it. So if you want something like that, drop some more money in the fundraiser and we'll help ensure that kids have a great Christmas next year. And now on with our regularly scheduled broadcasting. Every once in a while, one of you squishies asks me one of those questions like, what is this ship class? Or why is that ship that class and that ship some other class? Or what do all these classes mean? Well, I am here to tell you those are fucking complicated questions, especially since you humies suck at classification. Just ask any biologist. You still don't have a really good solid definition of life yet, much less how to categorize life into meaningful boxes. And yes, in general, some ship classes have remained fairly consistent in their design and purpose over the entire life of the term. Some ship classes are absolute fucking nightmares, and there's not a whole lot of actual stuff in between. So instead of actually doing the complicated work, instead of actually putting in the effort, we're going to take the easy way out, as we often do, and talk about classes as they stand right now and compare them. So you might have some understanding of how each one fits in each individual slot that they do. We will probably loop back around to this topic again and talk about some of those complicated classes in the future, but again, not for the purposes of this episode. For this episode, like I said, we will be comparing the classes against each other, and for that purpose, I have come up with a handy-dandy 5-point scale to compare those ships and talk about how they do different things, differently. And those 5 points will be applied to a variety of different characterizations that make a ship a ship. For example, displacement. This is literally how much water the ship displaces, moves out of the way, when you put the ship in the water. It's how you measure a ship's mass, give or take a little. Unfortunately, this particular scale had to be logarithmic on account of comparing ships that displaced 750 tons all the way up to 120,000 tons. 1 to 5 point scale isn't great for dividing that into 5 even sections, so logarithmic it is. Moving on, we'll also, of course, be talking about speed, how fast a vessel can move through the water. Related to speed is another characteristic commonly referred to as legs in aircraft, and I particularly like the term, so we might as well use it here. It's basically endurance. How far can a ship go before requiring refueling? Now, I specify refueling because food is also somewhat important to you squishies, and some of these ships can last far longer than you can without food. So we'll talk about that when we get there. Next up is sensors. How well can the ship detect the outside world, and how does it do it? How effectively does it do it? And related to sensors, at least for military ships, is throw weight. How much hurt can that ship put down range, and how quickly, and how accurately? And how many kilotons equivalent of TNT can it toss at the enemy? Well, again, there are a few interesting cases that we will talk about when we get there. Next up is defenses. Now, this one is a little complicated because your species has transitioned from passive defensives, that is to say, making your hull thicker and thicker and thicker to the point where nothing can get through, hopefully, all the way to active defenses, where now your hull is paper thin and you shoot down the incoming things, hopefully, before they hit your ship. We've talked about that previously before. It's regardless of whether or not the CWIS active defense system is effective or not, it complicates the defense scale. We'll try to normalize that across the changes that you have gone through, but no promises. The penultimate characterization is parasite craft. What other vehicles do these ships carry on board? Do they carry other vehicles on board? It's not necessarily a requirement. Some ships are absolutely dedicated to it. It's kind of a weird dichotomy. And finally, cargo capacity. Yes, cargo capacity, even for military ships. This is relevant. We'll talk about why. Now, as I mentioned, I will be talking about these classes in their current or final form. I am mostly using the USAEN concept of these ships because there's lots of documentation on your intertubes, which makes the research easier. However, that said, I am pulling in some classes that the USAENs do not float at all and do not float presently. So we'll diversify things a little just to cover most of our bases, and we'll go from there. And to go ahead and jump right in, we are actually going to start with the humble tugboat. Yes, tugs, those little things you see in harbors pushing around larger ships. Well, the problem with tugboats is that they technically come in kind of three major classifications. There's a seagoing variety, there's a harbor variety, and then there's the river variety. Now, there's an argument that the river variety are actually towboats, and we will actually have another slide for them. And we did actually talk about towboats during the Millennium Falcon episode, so you should already have some idea of what those are. And because of that, we're actually going to separate towboats from tugboats in this situation. Now, that still causes a problem of seagoing versus harbor, but still, they overlap well enough that we might as well just run with it. Anyways, tugboats, they're small ships. They do technically have a displacement, but it's so small that it actually fell off the logarithmic scale, so they ranked out as 0. They are not notoriously fast, but they are quite powerful, and that comes by way of typically either a quart nozzle system, otherwise known as a ducted propeller, or a cyclorotor, which is most commonly compared to the mixing attachments on your food mixers. They're significantly more complicated than that, but that's the best way of comparing them. And these tugboats use that power to, like I said, push around larger ships or move around barges, either close to the shore or even at sea. So they do have some degree of legs. They can go some distance, not terribly far. They typically just go up and down coasts, but still it's there. In terms of sensors, they typically just mount some sort of Furuno equivalent surface search radar that has a range of 12 to 15 nautical miles, give or take a little, and is particularly useful because it can pick up weather patterns as it comes over the horizon. They obviously do not have weapons of any sort, or really any kind of defenses, but their cargo capacity is complicated too, because after all, the tug itself is not large and can't carry a whole lot of cargo on board. However, that big flat thing behind it or in front of it does carry a whole lot of cargo and is pushing it around, so you might as well give it some credit for that. As we shift to the towboat, i.e. the riverine tugboat, you see nothing much changes. They're still quite small, they're still somewhat slow but powerful. They can still go a decent distance, they still just mount basic radar. They're still typically unarmed, with no parasite craft at all, but they can also push around larger amounts of barges than just the traditional tugboat. Towboats are actually optimized to push around arrays of barges, like a 4x4 grid or a 4x5. I forget how large they can get on some rivers, but they're quite large and can carry quite a lot of material, so they get some credit for the cargo capacity. Now, in terms of tugboats and towboats and science fiction, the best analogy is probably some sort of limited local type vehicle that is meant for either helping with docking or pushing around cargo pods, something that does not have faster than light travel capability. It might not even be able to make the slow boat burn from one planet to the next. It is simply a short distance, heavy haul orbital transfer vehicle. And that might be all it does, is just moving things from one orbit to another. There might be a dedicated model that moves things to the surface and back up again, but that is basically the short-range premise of a tugboat or towboat, which is why I discard the notion that the Millennium Falcon was originally designed as a tugboat or towboat. She has a hyperdrive. It came from the factory that way. It's obviously meant for long-distance hauls. Which, of course, brings us to the lake freighter. Now, this is something somewhat unique to the North American continent, and they may not be encountered anywhere else on your planet. It's somewhat hard to say. But the basic premise is that the Great Lakes in the middle of your North American continent have their own dedicated fleet of ships. In fact, they are ships that are so large that they have to be built in the lakes, and they cannot leave the lakes because they are larger than the waterways and locks exiting the lakes allow. Now, that's not actually saying a whole lot, because the largest of them is only 1,013.5 feet long and 105 feet wide. But still, that's actually somewhat of a large ship, so they're worthy of talking about in their own right. As you can see, displacement took a huge step up, because suddenly, instead of just pushing around flat-bottom barges that have the cargo on them and may not be necessarily counted against the towboat or tugboat's displacement, lake freighters themselves carry the cargo in themselves. They are actual proper freighters. However, since they are in fact confined to the Great Lakes area, those 5 lakes up there, they are more probably commonly analogous to planetary or possibly interplanetary freighters. Again, no faster than light, no long-haul jumps, nothing like that. They are just short-range, not necessarily hoppers, because Lake Superior is a quite large lake, and it gets some pretty decent sea states, although it's not technically a sea, but still, the ships are not going very far. So again, probably a planetary freighter, but a actual freighter, not something just pushing around cargo containers, something that you're unloading and loading directly. Now, some would argue with me that the next categorization, intra-coastal freighter, is not significantly different from the lake freighters I was just previously talking about. And honestly, I won't really argue the point very much. The primary difference is that intracoastal freighters are specifically designed to go up and down the coasts of, continents. And the North American continent, at least, does have an intracoastal waterway that they can navigate if they feel like it. But still, they are technically open water if shallow water seagoing vessels, as opposed to the open water freshwater vessels found on the lakes. Again, it's a narrow distinction, but still I'm going to do it because lake freighters, like I said, are analogous to somewhat like planetary freighters, or possibly moon-type freighters, moon-to-planet loop freighters. Intra-coastal freighters are intra-system freighters, not inter-system freighters, but internal to the system freighters. So they might not have full honest-to-God FTL, but they probably have much longer legs and much more powerful engines than, say, the planetary freighters. They do planetary loops. They probably do gravity slingshots or whatever's necessary. They might have a very low-power, very low-speed FTL system that makes the 40-day, 60-day jaunt shorter. But they are definitely planet-to-planet freighters, but they stay inside of a system. They don't go out into the dark deep. Instead, that's a job for the deep water freighters. Or I suppose you could also call them the blue water freighters. Anyways, these are things that are commonly referred to as cargo ships or container ships, tankers, dry bulk carriers, multi-purpose vessels, feeder ships, roll-on, roll-off vessels, reefer ships. All these things I file into the general category of freighter. And one big problem of really quantifying and classifying freighters on your planet is there's 17 tillion different variations of them, even beyond what they're actually carrying, specifically because freighters have to be designed to fit into certain things. One of the original limitations on freighters way back in the day was the Panama Canal, the original Panama Canal, the first one. And that limitation was commonly referred to as the Panamax. A Panamax freighter was the maximum size of freighter that would fit through the Panama Canal. And it was actually a 3-dimensional limitation because there were bridges it had to fit under and locks it had to fit into, which defined its length, width, and draft. Now, however, there's the Neo-Panamax because the Panama Canal has added new locks, and significantly larger ships can fit through the canal now. But in addition to the Panamax and Neo-Panamax requirements, there is also the Seaway Max. That is the St. Lawrence Seaway, the route out of the Great Lakes that I was referring to earlier, which is a much smaller limitation than the Panamax. And then the China Max, the Balta Max, Q Max, Suez Max, and Malacca Max. I like Malacca Max. Kind of fun to say. And typically, most freighters are built to fit at least one of those limitations of sizes. Obviously, some of the sizes can fit into others of the sizes. If you build a Seaway Max freighter, it will clearly fit in Panamax, Neo-Panamax, and so on and so forth. But still, they try to build things specifically for certain maximum requirements. But I do say typically for a reason. There are ships that just eschew any kind of size limitation at all. For example, the TI class supertanker. It don't fit through shit. So if it has to transit from the Atlantic to the Pacific or vice versa, it's got to go the long way around. But anyways, for the purposes of numbers and for the purposes of comparison, I went ahead and used the Neo-Panamax as kind of the middle ground freighter size for the 5-point scoring system. And as you can see, the displacement is quite large and the cargo capacity is also quite large. In fact, that freighter displaces more than anything else on the list that we will be talking about. So yeah, it gets the 5. It also can go further and faster than any other freighter before it, and carry more in the process. Amusingly, it still just has basic surface search Furuno-style radar, so it's still just picking up blips and bleeps and bloops out there and weather and trying to avoid all of them. The I mean, almost no freighter going across the pond has people on the bridge. They set up their autopilot system, they connect it to their radar system, they tell the autopilot that they don't want to come within, say, 5 nautical miles of anything that the radar detects, as long as it doesn't take them more than 5 nautical miles off their track, and then they go downstairs and go to sleep or play bridge or poker or whatever the hell it is that the freighter crews do on their 2 weeks they have between ports. And there ain't no one up on the bridge, which is all kinds of exciting sometimes, because they do not respond to bridge hails, which can make crossing or meeting out on the ocean a very complicated and annoying process for anyone who does have people on the bridge. Anyways, regardless, as you have probably figured out by now, I am analogizing the deep water freighters to inter-system freighters in any kind of science fiction setting. These definitely have some sort of FTL drive, whether it's putting people in stasis and doing it the hard way, or whether it's some sort of like Blink style drive where suddenly you're here and suddenly you're there. It doesn't really matter. These are definitely inter-system freighters. These cross the galaxy. These go into the deep dark and come back out again and fight pirates and do all that good fun stuff. And this is one of the hard points of why comparing your current nautical vehicles to science fiction vehicles is so complicated. Typically, to do long, deep water journeys, you have to have a somewhat substantial ship. You can't just take some little rubber dinghy out there and hope you'll make it, although people keep trying for some reason. Whereas in situations like Star Wars, an A-wing can literally jump across the galaxy if someone wanted to spend enough time in the cockpit. And those are tiny. I mean, you'd probably have to replenish some sort of life support system or something along the way, but still, it could do it, and it wouldn't be that big of a deal. Whereas here, it's a big deal when people can, like, solo sail across the ocean or whatever. Because it is a big deal. Because the ocean hates you and wants to kill you. Space doesn't care either way. But enough about the condensed liquefied hate that covers most of your planet. On to the interesting things. That is to say, the first proper warship to be mentioned so far in this list. A corvette. What is a corvette? Well, in this case, it is not a line of American two-door, two-seat luxury sports cars. Sorry. Instead, it is literally the smallest class of vessel to be considered a warship, a proper or rated warship. Anything below that is just kind of like an accessory ship, and anything above that we'll get to there. But corvettes traditionally, and still, oddly enough, this is one of the classes that has not changed meaning over the years, are just the smallest warship available. And yeah, the term actually goes all the way back to the era of sails when ships were wood and men were iron, and the term hasn't changed meaning ever since. So that is somewhat surprising, as we'll mention here in a little bit. Anyways, as you can see, corvettes are small, zippy little fuckers that do actually have some degree of range available to them, although they typically stick to what's called the green water, the shallows. They typically don't go deep, and they typically don't go cross oceans. Beyond that, they also have upgraded sensor suites. In addition to standard surface search radar, they might actually have an air search radar system. And finally, as mentioned previously, they are in fact armed. They can be armed with anything from, 7.62 millimeter machine guns all the way up to 30 millimeter cannons, and even more things than that, depending on how you want to stretch and mutilate the term corvette. The big takeaway, though, is that these are small, light craft that typically stay close to the shore while still being able to actually, throw some weight around. And amusingly, this is one case where Star Wars actually came close to getting a fair comparison by way of course, the Corellian Corvette, otherwise known as the Blockade Runner. It was a small, light craft that could throw some weight around. It was typically relegated to system protection duties, but it did actually have a hyperdrive that could allow it to go across the galaxy if it wanted to. So, I'm sure there are some Corvettes who can actually make an ocean transit if they were refueled mid-route, so I suppose that is a fair analogy. Amusingly, Star Trek does appear to have the concept of corvettes, although they never really come up in any of the movies or TV shows or anything like that. They are listed and mentioned in occasional episodes, but you never actually get to see what the craft actually look like. More's a pity. Next up on our list of actual military craft to be compared is a cutter. Now, this is unfortunately one of the complicated terms. The term cutter can apply to the sailing rig, except that there are regional differences in definition and arrangement. It can refer to the actual ship, although it can refer to everything from a ship to a rowboat of a specific type, or it can refer to, as we are doing in this particular case, to a governmental enforcement agency vessel. There is an argument, again, to be made that cutters are basically corvettes with a funnier name. And again, I won't argue that point too tremendously, as you can see by the comparison between the two. The only significant difference between a cutter and a corvette is that a cutter has slightly longer legs, actually significantly longer legs, and it can typically support parasite craft because it is a law enforcement vessel in the case of the USAians. Almost every Coast Guard large ship is a quote-unquote cutter, aside from their icebreakers and a few other specialized craft. Anyways, thanks to its parasite craftedness, it can actually send over small boats or helicopters to investigate things more personally. And due to its longer legs, it can do things like go up and explore the Arctic or do crazy things like that. And make no mistake, I'm not sure about other countries, but the USAians Coast Guard organization, while it is technically part of the Orwellian-named Department of Homeland Security during peacetime, it can be absorbed into the Department of Defense during wartime, which does functionally make these warships. And in fact, Coast Guard cutters can be armed with up to 3-inch or 76mm guns and possibly even larger. So again, they can throw down some limited degree of hurt, and they have the sensor suite necessary to figure out where that hurt should go. So again, we're getting a little bigger, a little more capable, a little more everything. And then we get to the first of two really, really complicated ship class names. And that is to say frigate. Man, the variations and twists on how that term has been applied over the years is definitely worthy of its own episode that we will get to at some point. For the time being, we are only going to talk about it in the context that it is currently being used by basically all the navies on your planet. And that is to say, a small, but not the smallest, warship capable of, crossing oceans and actually doing full-size warship things, while still being somewhat, like I said, on the smaller side, inexpensive, not as capable as its big brothers. And no, just for clarification, the Little Crappy Ship, aka the Littoral Combat Ship, is not a frigate. It's an ambulatory boat anchor to which they attached a boat anchor. I have no idea why they did that, but that's the way it worked out in the end. So we're just ignoring that whole nightmare. So amusingly, the United States Navy does not currently operate any frigates, having now decommissioned all of the old Oliver Hazard Perry-class frigates. But regardless, this is meant to be kind of the first real, honest-to-God, over-the-horizon, actual Navy warship. You could think of the Corvette, like I said, as a Corvette and from Star Wars, and they're predominantly used for planetary defense roles, even though they do occasionally have hyperdrives. The cutters don't have any really good solid parallels in either Star Trek or Star Wars, given that neither seem to maintain a Coast Guard equivalent, which is all kinds of terrifying because there is a lot of empty space out there to get lost in. And the Coast Guard's primary duty when it's not painting buoys is saving you squishy humies from doing stupid things in stupid boats. But beyond that, the frigate is really the first, at least system defense craft, if not a forward, offense craft. The frigate that the USAian Navy will be replacing the Little Crappy ships with will actually have vertical launch cells and a main gun and some anti-ship missiles and some other good fun stuff like that. So it can go out there and punch something in the nose and hopefully get away, given that one of the points of frigates is that they are small and fast. And once again, we have a fairly decent analogy in the Star Wars universe, although it is neither small nor fast, and that is by way of the Nebulon B frigate. It is a definition of the frigate. After all, like I said, the term has a complicated and complex history, and it is predominantly used as a frigate when it is not a medical transport of some fashion or another. It is a system defense craft, or it is a support craft for an invading fleet. Likewise, the Star Trek universe has the Kelvin and Saladin classes. Basically, these are single nacelle, single saucer, sometimes separate engineering section ships that are the light scout craft of the Federation, basically. They can go out in the deep space, they can do Deep Space Federation things, but they are not exactly the heavy hitters. And much like the USAian Coast Guard is in the end a military organization, yes, the Starfleet is a military organization as well. I don't care the lies they try or the public affairs campaign they run to the contrary. You will not convince me otherwise. Sorry. Which I suppose brings us to the next really obnoxiously complicated class name on the list. Destroyer. What is a destroyer? No one knows. I mean, seriously, if you look up the history of the term destroyer, it is fucking ridiculous. Again, another episode, not this one. Fuck's sake. I swear to the great maker, I have no idea how this term evolved in this particular fashion, but it doesn't matter. Right now, we're going to talk about destroyers as they are currently being used by, again, most navies on your planet. And yes, here we see some of the first Combat 5s on our list. Yes, the destroyers are quite fast. Yes, they typically have very good sensors. The USAN destroyers in specific have a system on board called Spy-1, which ties into their Aegis system. And that is a total tactical command and control system. And the Spy-1 phased array radar is a ridiculously good radar system and ridiculously powerful. It can function as its own jammer. It is so actually powerful. So yeah. These things can literally pick up falling leaves if you dial them up far enough, although it's not typically healthy for any organic in the nearby area. Regardless, good sensors. And then yes, the throw weight on destroyers is pretty significant. They are not technically a replacement for battleships if you fill all of their vertical launch cells with tomahawks, but honestly, I don't think the opponent will really notice that much of a difference in the end. Still, technically not a battleship, so therefore not 5. And, of course, they do have good defenses. They have standard missiles, they have CIWS, they have all kinds of things to keep things off of them. And, of course, their electronic warfare suite is equally advanced. As for Parasite craft, it does maintain at least 1, probably 2 helicopters on its stern, as well as 1 or 2 ribs, small boats that can be launched. So, yeah, this is the first full heavyweight fighting ship on the list. This thing is meant to go out and make an absolute mess of the enemy. And amusingly, technically, I suppose Star Wars has a parallel by way of, obviously, the Star Destroyers, and that is what they do as well. They go out and make a mess of things. There is a significant contention in the lore, history, knowledge section group things that Star Destroyer may refer to either destroying stars or a class of destroyer. No one knows, once again, but they're not really analogous aside from the fact that they both want to f things up. Destroyers are not exactly small. They're only marginally smaller than cruisers, modern cruisers. So it's hard to say what a good comparison in the Star Wars universe would be. Now, for Star Trek, of course, the great almighty Starfleet would never deign to create a ship called a destroyer. What an unhealthy name that is. Yeah, I know. Honestly, destroyers are somewhat comparable to, like, Constitution-class cruisers in Star Trek, only because they are somewhat small. I know they're technically called cruisers, but Star Trek also had heavy cruisers and other kind of cruisers, so really that's kind of the best comparison I can come up with there. And since I am talking about cruisers, I guess I should actually talk about cruisers. The cruiser name is actually complicated, too. Of course, it's all complicated. It's all complicated! Cruiser used to be a term for the job, not the ship. Any number of types of ships could be cruisers, in that they would go out and cruise the sea lanes looking for something to jump, basically. And then eventually the term started applying to a specific ship specifically built for a specific job, and then we had cruisers. The USAN Navy is slowly phasing out their line of cruisers, the Ticonderoga class, but they still linger around, and they still have the same Aegis system that the destroyers did, although possibly a less advanced system. They are slightly larger, so they have slightly longer legs, and that's really about the only difference. Technically they carry more VLS cells than a destroyer does, but the end result basically boils out the same in the end. The Arleigh Burke class of destroyers are significantly more advanced than the Tycho class of cruisers, so in my book they're basically equivalent, although one is longer and narrower, the other is shorter and fatter and slightly lighter. Same dual helo garage in the back, same flight deck in the back. I think cruisers, some of them mounted 2 guns as opposed to the 1 gun that the destroyer did. We're talking marginal differences here. And since we are talking about marginal differences, I suppose this is another place where Star Wars stumbled into getting something close to correct. The obvious parallels in that universe are the Mon Calamari cruisers, the organic-looking ones that the larger of which can stand toe-to-toe against Star Destroyers. So, marginal differences, I guess it all plays out right in the end. And as I mentioned previously, Star Trek relies heavily on the cruiser motif, so there's no shortage of options there. Suffice to say that any one of them could and has turned into a destroyer whenever it wanted to. They are, after all, military ships. But enough about the various and sundry failings of the United Federation of Planets, otherwise known as the Starfleet or the Federation or whatever the hell. It doesn't actually matter in this context. Because, you see, you might think you know the next step above a cruiser. You might think you have an idea of the next big ship that comes above a cruiser. Because, I mean, honest to the great maker, there is an entire culture on your planet that is dedicated to telling you that the next step above a cruiser is this thing. Well, they're wrong, amusingly enough. Although they are right in a particularly weird way. See, after cruisers came the concept of battle cruisers. What does that mean? No one knows. Like, literally, no one knows. I mean, technically, officially, by the paperwork, and has anyone ever trusted the paperwork coming out of the Pentagon, Army, or USA province ever? No. Anyways, battle cruisers. Battle cruisers are what happen when you take a cruiser hull and you try to strap battleship guns onto it. Sometimes it works. Most times it doesn't. There are, of course, some notable exceptions to the most times they don't idea, but still the basic premise is we have a cruiser-sized ship. We're going to strap some battleship-sized guns on it and see what it can do. Well, the good news is it can actually outstrip a battleship in distance and speed fairly easily. It can't hold up very well, though, because the whole point is you're putting battleship guns on a cruiser ship. Cruisers aren't meant for, knock-down, drag-out fights. That's the realm of actual, honest-to-God battleships. Cruisers are meant for hit and run, and mostly run. But once you put battleship guns on them, well, they hit hard, and hopefully they run fast. As it turns out, they did, in fact, hit hard. They did not run fast enough to make them worthwhile. The battle cruiser concept hung around far longer than it probably should have. But honestly, yeah, strapping battleship guns onto a cruiser-class hull was never going to be a good idea, and it only got worse with application. Which I suppose, honest to the great maker, brings us to the actual great maker equivalent battleships on your planet. Because, I mean, honestly, this list would be just horribly wrong if I did not include actual, honest to the great maker, battleships. The fun thing about battleships is that they are quite large, as you might determine from her displacement number 4 on a logarithmic scale. And yet, despite that, they are also very, very oddly fast. What differentiates them from battle cruisers, though, is she got no legs. She has really limited range. An average battle cruiser can go 12,000 nautical miles without refueling. An average battleship can go 1,500. We're talking an order of magnitude difference here, and wow, that sucks. But for all that difference in legs, she's got to bring something to the party, right? Well, basically, it boils down to defenses. She is an aquatic tank. That is what battleships boil down to. I'm not saying that she can shrug off every hit she receives. In fact, battleships don't exist anymore on your current nautical playboard for a reason, because armor is not enough to protect itself against various and sundry weapons that would, try and hit that armor. But still, the whole point of battleships was to suck up damage and throw back more than they received. And honestly, on average, they kind of did that. Because battleships, wow. Especially the USAN battleships, they came by way of an old style of warfare. And then the USANs just keep bolting on new and different ways of fighting war onto the battleship. They bolted on harpoon launchers. They bolted on phalanx close-in weapon systems. They bolted on everything, and they kept trying to keep this battleship, current and cogent and meaningful. And unfortunately, technology caught up with it. Ship killers will just annihilate a battleship without even noticing it. And there is literally no amount of armor you can put in front of modern ship killer missiles that will make an honest to God difference. But for her time and for her period, she was the king. Queen? That's a complicated conversation. Most USAN ships are female, whereas most Russian ships are male. So is it fair to say a battleship, a USAN battleship, is the king of the sea or the queen of the sea? Odd conversation, question, irrelevant to the point. Anyways, USAN battleships were just the premier combat vessel on the seas for a very long time for a very good reason. Notably, if they didn't like you, they could put a VW Bug's worth of explosive ordnance somewhere near you. Yeah, that tends to get people's attention. She couldn't go far. She didn't have great sensors. She didn't care about tossing boats in the water to go inspect some other boats or something like that. Oh no, battleships' only one and single job was to f*** your face up. And honestly, they did a pretty good job of it. There is a whole pile of reasons why battleships are no longer in the USAN Navy. In fact, they're not part of any Navy at all anymore. And that's a very complicated conversation that we will save for another episode. For the meantime, suffice to say, the battleships were the premier combat vehicle on the oceans, I suppose. And then, things got weird. Because ironically, the one things that battle cruisers got right is a fast-moving vehicle with big guns has value. But a massive, honest to the great maker tank of a ship that everyone knows where it is, well, yeah, it can throw down some hurt, and it has thrown down some hurt. And I hope in the future it will throw down some hurt, but everyone's going to throw down some hurt at it. And this is the big catch of battleships. They are floating artillery batteries, no questions asked, but they are also massive targets. And while conventional ballistic, shell-type artillery will probably not phase them at all, ship killer missiles, well, honestly, they were mostly designed to take out, battleships. That was their whole point. That was one of the reasons that the Soviets actually built ship killer missiles, is to take out the Iowa-class battleships that the USANs put out. Oh. Well, that's awkward. But wait, someone screams from the background. Why aren't you talking about dreadnoughts? Well, because dreadnoughts aren't actually a thing. That's why. There are pre-World War I battleships and World War I battleships. And then there's transition-era battleships. And then there's World War II battleships. And then there's post-World War II battleships, although the transition and the post both kind of occupy the same space. And dreadnoughts basically are the transition between World War I and World War II. Sort of, kind of, maybe. Dreadnoughts technically occurred during the First World War on your planet. And the term dreadnought specifically applies to warships that have what is called all-or-nothing armor. That is to say that most of the ship is armored-ish, but there's a central core of the ship that is absurdly armored, impenetrable by some definitions. And the idea was that as long as the citadel held, the rest of the ship would be okay, right? And that is, in the end, the meaning of the dreadnought. It fears nothing because nothing can penetrate its citadel. And yes, citadel is a term that the nautical navy is borrowing from the terrestrial castles that you humies seem to build infrequently across your continents. It is, in fact, the last redoubt. It's the last place you want to fight from. It is the only place, the primary place that you want to defend. And that is why dreadnoughts were built to protect this thing so thoroughly. Yes, the rest of the ship did, in fact, have armor. The all-or-nothing name is somewhat inaccurate, but the armor was, armor in name only. When it came to the Citadel, however, there were no shells at the time of the production of dreadnoughts that could penetrate the amount of armor that actually surrounded the citadel of the dreadnoughts. This is why they were actually called dreadnoughts. The rest of the ship could fall apart around them, but as long as the thing was still floating, it was still fighting. Now, as naval architecture changed, the concept of dreadnought kind of evaporated, because citadels were still retained, but the surface and deck and skin armor of the ship increased to the point where the entire ship was significantly more armored than even the citadels of First World War generation dreadnoughts. So what do you call those? I mean, dreadnoughts feared nothing, right? That's why you called them that. What do you call something where the entire ship fears nothing? Well, in this case, I guess an Iowa-class battleship, right? Damn. But all right, fine. Enough about the old kings of the oceans. What about the current kings of the ocean? Well, that's an easy question to answer, and they are, in fact, carriers. And yes, this is one case where our scale system, broke. Because you see, modern nuclear carriers have as long a leg as, you can keep the humies on board fed. And I know I'm not stuttering. Modern carriers can keep going for as long as their reactor pile will last, which on average is about 25 years between refueling. And 25 years isn't like, oh no, we ran out of fuel. It's just, it's not quite working as well as we wanted it to, so we're going to replace it and make it better. And since modern carriers are running on nuclear piles, and since nuclear piles produce all the electricity you could ever need for anything, water is not a limitation because, desalination plants are easy to do when you have unlimited electricity. So really, again, the only limitation is food. And I guess in like an end of the world scenario, you could do some kind of snow crash thing where you could convert the flight deck into like a garden system, and you could feed a skeleton crew of the ship to keep it afloat and running. So, I mean, again, technically, carriers basically have infinite legs. Unlike millipedes, which do not actually have 1,000 legs, which is very confusing, but that's entirely besides the point. And yes, if you'll note the chart, carriers only rank a 4 on displacement. Yes, they are actually smaller than the super freighters that transit your oceans. How terrifying is that? And yes, technically, officially, their speed is slower than a battleship. I don't buy it, but I'm just running off the publicized numbers. I'm not supposed to talk about the other numbers. That might get me in trouble. So I'm going with the numbers that are official and known, and technically she is slightly slower. But like I said, she's got all the legs. She's got infinite legs for all intents and purposes. And in terms of a sensor suite, well, I mean, given that she literally carries aircraft on board her that are meant to expand and enlarge her sensor observation area, well, yeah, she definitely gets a 5 in that case. And likewise, when it comes to throw weight, well, most modern carriers are not allowed to mount nuclear weapons anymore, except in, certain circumstances. But beyond that, they still put down a lot of hurt. A lot of hurt. They carry a lot of ordnance on board. And they can deliver it, courtesy of the aircraft, with shocking accuracy. So, yeah, there we go. 5. In terms of defenses, of course, once again, we are at, 5. I mean, the modern aircraft carrier mounts at least 4 close-in weapon systems, as well as an entire air wing or 2 or possibly 3 that are meant to keep things off of her. And yes, some of those aircraft are configured and equipped to take down ship killers before they get to the carrier. That's kind of the point. Which brings us, of course, to the parasite craft. Of course, carriers rank 5. Look at the number of aircraft they carry. What else would you rank them as? And as for cargo capacity, besides the fact that they are literally floating cities, the fact remains that they can just carry a lot of stuff on board. I mean, there is an apocryphal story on your planet that has certainly never actually happened, where carriers were returning from their deployments in the Mediterranean. And of course, when you're returning from the Mediterranean, you don't really need to maintain flight operations. So of course, they would allow their sailors on board to buy cars from countries adjacent to the Mediterranean Sea and just load them onto the flight deck and bring them home. And whether that story is apocryphal or not, and it totally is, the fact remains that when carriers do homeport shifts, the way that the sailors actually move their cars from one homeport to the other is loading them onto the flight deck, and the carrier takes them from the one homeport to the next. And yeah, once you start thinking about the flight deck and the hangars as cargo space, yeah, carriers can, carry a lot of things. But I am sure that all of y'all know what a carrier is, so this is all kind of belaboring the point. What about other specialized vehicles that specifically, for example, the United States Navy operates? Well, I guess that would lead us to the amphibious assault concept. Sadly, these ships are not actually amphibious, which was very disappointing to me when I discerned that. Instead, they actually carry inside of them vehicles that are amphibious, and they literally sink themselves to release these ships by way of their well decks, and these amphibious assault vehicles float out of their well decks and then go off and do actual amphibious assault things. Yeah, kind of strange when you phrase it that way, isn't it? I mean, seriously, who would actually design a ship that was intentionally meant to sink, as opposed to a boat that was deliberately meant to sink, like, say, a submarine? Like I said, all submarines are boats, and all ships are ships. Never mind. Moving on. These amphibious assault ships are not large. They are not fast. They do have pretty decent legs, but they are not heavily equipped in the sensor arena. The more modern versions of the amphibious assault craft can tie into the link system that Aegis uses, that where Aegis shares the contact information of anything it sees with everything else it can connect to that has the appropriate link version. So they can work with other ships' sensors, but their onboard sensors are not great. And they really have no honest-to-God offensive weapons. The new versions do have like 30mm cannons and stuff, but they're mostly just meant for self-defense against pirates and stuff like that. They can go out and throw a pencil-necked, thin-armed punch if they have to. They would prefer not to. And likewise, they do mount some defenses, but they're not great. I mean, they have 1 or 2 close-in weapon systems, 1 or 2 rolling airframe missile systems. It's not awesome. What they do have, however, are parasite craft and cargo capacity, especially for their equivalent cost and size. Like I said, they carry amphibious assault vehicles, whether those are actual AAVs, and yes, that acronym does in fact expand to Assault Amphibious Vehicle, and technically they are officially known as an AAVP TAC 7A1, formerly known as a Landing Vehicle Tracked Personnel 7, or an LVTP TAC 7. But regardless, it's an amphibious assault vehicle. Whether they are carrying those, or whether they are carrying landing craft air cushion, otherwise known as, hovercraft, they specialize in getting equipment from the ship to the shore. Yes, they are in fact marine buses. They are buses for crayon eaters. Yes, you heard that right. These amphibious assault ships' entire job is to get leathernecks from point A to point B with their hardware, and then transition them from the ship to the shore. And they do it pretty well. Well, they do it pretty well as long as you don't compare them against what I will refer to as helicarriers. In the U.S. Navy parlance nonsense, you can think of them as the America class. Very large ships that are as large, they have as large a flight deck on them as World War II carriers did. But their hangar inside and then their well deck, remember that space that I told you about in the amphibious assault ship where they flooded the ship and it sank down a little and it let out little boats inside of it? Yeah, that's called a well deck. And well, the well deck on the helicarrier is large. And yeah, helicarriers aren't nearly as big as carriers actually, even though they rank as a 4 on a logarithmic scale. Helicarriers rank in at about 50,000 tons, whereas actual carriers are about 100,000 tons. So, I mean, it's not fair to say they're both 4s, but again, logarithmic scale. They're not fast. I mean, they don't have nukes on board. They're typically gas turbine or diesel powered. I guess gas turbine now technically with, your world getting away from diesel because evil or whatever. They do last forever though. They have decent sensors, basically about the same kind of suite as their smaller counterparts. They have about the same throw weight capacity as their smaller counterparts. They might not even actually mount the 30mm cannons. So, I mean, maybe even giving them a 1 is being tremendously generous. Their defenses are, of course, significantly better because they do have more close-in weapon systems mounts, as well as, parasite craft that can get off the ship and possibly defend the ship from aggressors or individual missiles. And, like I mentioned, their parasite complement is much larger. I mean, the amphibious assault craft ship did have the capacity for significant numbers of helos as well as amphibious vehicles. The helicarrier, well, it's not the Marvel helicarrier, the stupid one we already talked about, but it can carry a lot of stuff. While their smaller brother can only carry a single LCAC, a landing craft air cushion, this thing can carry 2, in addition to a whole pile of vehicles on its staging decks above the well deck. And then there's, the whole flight deck, which can literally land anything from, an Osprey to a Lightning and a Harrier and a Super Stallion and a King Stallion and a Venom and a Viper and a Nighthawk. This thing can land anything that can do VTOL or STOVL or whatever it's called. And on top of that, it's a fairly competent hospital ship too, because of course it is meant to support, a landing assault on a beach, which yes, involves the attack, but also involves the actual support. In fairness, the medical wing on these things is not nearly as big as dedicated hospital ships, but it is as capable in terms of what kind of wounds it can treat. It just doesn't have the same kind of throughput numbers. And in the same vein, given that she is meant to do an amphibious assault on a beach, she has a pretty decent cargo capacity available to her. Whether she's carrying tanks or troops or combination thereof, she can carry a lot of whatever it is. And yeah, I did miss talking about how these things might relate to science fiction. I mean, honestly, I figured y'all could figure out what a battle cruiser might look like in science fiction and a battleship in science fiction. In terms of carrier and amphibious assault ship and helicarrier, I mean, the distinctions get kind of vague. You know what a carrier is. You know what a carrier does. An amphibious assault ship in science fiction is technically like the smallest available carrier. It's a pocket carrier. It's not a battle carrier. That's a nightmare that never should have happened. But it's a small ship that carried small ships on it that could do limited, carrier operations. The helicarrier could do much larger operations, and the dedicated carrier can do all the operations. So in terms of the idea of amphibious assault, think of what it would take to land on a planet and hold a beachhead on that planet. Now that is a more complicated question than just landing on a shore, obviously. because the carrier is above the planet and visible against all the weapons that the planet can bring to bear against it. Whereas amphibious assault vehicles can literally park over the horizon and disgorge their vehicles that can make it to the shore and stay out of sight, basically. So as always, it's not necessarily a one-to-one relationship. I mean, even beyond that, you could argue that carriers, dedicated carriers, carry more fighters than, say, shuttles, whereas the amphibious assault equivalent would carry a lot more shuttles than fighters. Although when it comes to things like, say, Star Wars Rebels, every single shuttle in that freaking series was an assault shuttle, and they pretended it was a weak little thing, and except it's not. Did they lose the license to the Tidarium shuttle or something? I mean, they know they didn't. It showed up in 1 or 2 episodes. It's just like a pass-off. But still, why was there no Tidarium? Those were like the primary shuttle of the Empire, not the assault shuttle. I mean, assault shuttles were meant for, hot zone landings, even though the show tried to pretend they were weak and ineffective and basically unarmed, despite the fact that they were very heavily armed. Yeah, I don't really understand that. Anyways, moving on to the last 2 items on our comparison, the problematic ones. And I suppose we should start with the easier one of the 2, and that is the SSN, the Fast Attack Submarine. This is a submarine that is meant to go out and hunt things down and kill them, whether it's other submarines or more likely surface targets. They are small, they only have a displacement of 2 on, again, a logarithmic scale, but still, they have a speed of, 3, which makes them not terribly fast. But then we run into the we broke the scale problem again. Because once again, these are typically nuclear-powered vehicles. That is, after all, why they are called SSNs, Submarine Ship Nuclear. Although, amusingly, all subs are boats, so submarine ship is somewhat of a misnomer. Doesn't really matter. They're nuclear either way. They can run as long as there is food on board for the crew, which I guess is more complicated in this case because you can't have a very big garden on top of a hunter-killer submarine. But still, their legs will last as long as the reactor does, and by the same token, since they are submarines, they can keep a much better eye on the surface world than the surface world can keep on them, which is the whole point of the job. Now, in terms of throw weight, yes, SSNs are specifically designed to take out other SSNs or possibly other submarines in general, as well as surface targets, and they can also pop up Tomahawks or other cruise missiles and send them on their way. But they can't carry that many. In terms of defenses, though, good fucking luck finding them. That's the whole point. They're submarines, they disappear. Surface ships have a nightmare of a time finding these things. Naturally, on the flip side, these things don't have any parasite craft. They don't carry any boats, they don't carry any helicopters, they don't carry shit. It's just them and the deep blue, which they probably prefer it that way. And in the same token, they have absolutely no cargo capacity, which is again the limiting factor on their range. The problem isn't fuel. They get refueled, quote unquote, every 10 to 25 years, depending on the specific model. But the real problem is how much food they can keep on board. They make their own air. They make their own water. How much food can they carry? That's how long they'll last. And the same problem rears its ugly little head when it comes to SSBNs. Submarine Ship Ballistic Nuclear. And in terms of the same problem, that being how much food they have on board for the squishy humans that crew them, someone remind me to tell the story about the turnover turkey. It's kind of an essential part of at least the USA and SSBN community. But again, that's a different story for a different episode, because these SSBNs are larger than their SSN cousins. They didn't used to be. SSBNs used to be SSNs that were hacked and slashed and mutilated and somehow convinced to carry ballistic missiles, and that did not go well. And so eventually countries finally decided that they should actually build purpose-built submarines that were meant to carry ballistic missiles, so everything changed. Unfortunately, that larger displacement also means they're smaller. On the flip side, their quote-unquote legs, again discounting food, is the same basic infinite problem. They have basically the same sensor suite as SSNs, and they have basically the same defenses because they're still deep water craft. They're submarines. They can go deep and disappear. Now, on the odd side, some SSBNs can actually have parasite craft. Originally, this was some weird edge case of the SSBN core concept where one of the missile tubes would be converted into an airlock system for a DSRV equivalent vehicle to bolt onto the top of that particular missile tube. And by the way, DSRV stands for Deep Submergence Rescue Vehicle, of course. These were little tiny submarines that were meant to go and save other people in other submarines, but they also had the nice side effect of being able to carry, interesting combat personnel on board them and take them up to a shoreline in a way that would be less noticed than an actual submarine pulling up off your shoreline. Well, that general idea kind of took root. And when your USAN Navy decided to convert some number of SSBNs into SSGNs, well, they got their own special little tiny submarine, the ASDS, the Advanced Seal Delivery System. It is a purpose-built submarine that is not meant for deep sea rescue, that its whole job is to carry, seals, not the clap, clap, clap version, but the kind that will clap you to the shore, and, then they can do whatever they need to do, and then maybe the little mini sub will be waiting to recover them and take them back to the main sub. And to clarify some things, SSBNs again carry ballistic missiles, whereas SSGNs carry guided missiles as, Tomahawk kind of missiles, and in fact they carry a lot of them. I think at last accounting, the Ohio-class submarine had 24 missile tubes on board, and they were somehow able to shove 7 Tomahawks into each of those missile tubes. And granted, I think 4 of the tubes were reserved for airlock lockout systems for that ASDS system. So fine, you only have 20 times 7 Tomahawks available to you. That'll grab someone's attention, especially since no one knows where this submarine is, which again is its whole point. An SSBN is meant to go out into the ocean and disappear. And this is why, after all, she gets a, break the scale number for her throw weight. Because when an SSBN gets underway, she is the 3rd most nuclear-capable entity on the planet. Yeah, she ranks as a country, and it's a single submarine, and she has enough throw weight to displace number 3 on the scale. And how many do the USANs operate again? Oh, wow. That's all kinds of awkward. So what do these things equate to in a science fiction universe? Really, the only term applicable that you might be able to find are ghost ships. Ships that are out there, but ships that you can't find. And some of them are set up for anti-ship operations where they go and slide up to a much, much larger ship and just annihilate it. And some are set up with weapons that can delete entire solar systems. And in either case, you can't find them. That's the whole point of submarines, is they just go deep and disappear. And you have to believe that in whatever science fiction universe you're playing in, there are ships that can just engage cloaking fields or disruption fields or have the appropriate hull geometry or whatever that they can just, glance off any kind of sensors and not even be noticed, and then do crazy things. I mean, I remember in the expanded universe of Star Wars, when a certain asshole dropped cloaked asteroids around Coruscant to force the planet to keep its planetary shield up and cut it off from external support. Same basic idea. Just a lot more passive and a lot more sneaky, since he pretended he launched a lot more cloaked asteroids than he actually launched, but that's entirely besides the point. Anyways, here we are after an hour, and here is my breakdown of various ship classes as they compare to each other. This is not a in-depth, comprehensive, deep dive into what various ship classes actually are. This is simply a comparative comparison of how they compare. Yeah. Anyways, feel free to use this data or not. I mean, I could be wrong. There could be other comparisons that are more valid. I don't know. This is just my perception of your various ship classes and how they might translate in terms of comparative capabilities, and likewise in terms of how they might be presented in a science fiction type universe. Use it or not. We don't much care. And that's all from Sacred Cow Shipyards. Please be advised that any ship left on the docks for more than 24 hours will be compressed to a cube at the owner's expense. Have a nice day.